One of Jordan's performative outrage junkies dropped a comment that was brutally honest. Rather than disputing a single fact that was presented, the user casually explained that Jordan's take is functionally more valuable than the actual truth. Within this framework, skills, credentials, and the quality of the work fail to register entirely. The grift is simply repackaged as consumer preference. Jordan recently released a follow-up video that systematically executes every step of that tired formula. Consequently, we are not debating him. Instead, we are pulling back the curtain to demonstrate exactly how the machine operates. Will Jordan does not build an argument. Rather, he executes a repeatable loop. He consistently opens with a sympathy shield, stating something to the effect of, quote, "I'm not attacking her," before framing the film's failure as an inevitability akin to gravity. From that baseline, he slides insults in as casual observations, utilizing descriptors such as unlikable, vanity project, body of a child, or diversity hire. Next, he deploys a misdirect. The actual movie vanishes from the critique entirely and gets replaced with irrelevant things like boardroom gossip, marketing drama, and promotional interviews, by rigging the game so that no one can disprove his premises. Then he closes the loop with a signature catchphrase. So every talking point in his video follows this exact trajectory, and the grift victims in the comments swallow it line for line, adopting it as a script to regurgitate across the internet. So how does this work? First, Jordan asserts that Millie Alcock is not to blame because the studio threw her to the wolves, thereby deploying his initial shield. He immediately follows this by describing her as a relatively unknown 5'2" actress with the body of a child and a face that was inevitably going to look bad compared to her predecessors. Despite having just claimed that he was not attacking her, he critiques her physique as if evaluating furniture that clashes with the drapes. Critically, he bypasses her actual performance entirely, omitting the fact that she constructed the character around clinical PTSD research and even consulted trauma specialists to accurately map out survivor's guilt and dissociation. Although these elements are evident on screen, Jordan replaces the discussion of real craft with a party anecdote involving champagne at a premiere and an awkward answer to a loaded question. This swap is a consistent magic trick he employs wherever he pretends to be a film critic. When Jordan characterizes Kara Zor-El as prickly, arrogant, self-absorbent, messy, and crazy, he obliviously describes a genocide survivor. The character trait is not mere subtext, far from it. It constitutes the entire premise of the source material. The comic opens with a teenager witnessing the disintegration of Argo City, watching her mother die slowly of radiation poisoning and fighting a losing battle before her father sends her away. Experiencing such events leaves lasting psychological scars, a reality reflected in the clinical criteria for PTSD outlined in the DSM-5, which includes avoidance, negative mood, hyperarousal, irritability, and detachment. Jordan fails to recognize every single one of these symptoms and weaponizing them instead to label the character unlikable. In doing so, he ignores how these traits create a fleshed-out three-dimensional character. In stark contrast to the flat two-dimensional figures Jordan wrote for his own failed TV pilot. He mocks psychological depth because he does not understand how to construct a realistic three-dimensional character on screen the way the Supergirl filmmakers did. Jordan's performative contempt is completely oblivious of the structural model of the Supergirl film. The director and screenwriter have publicly stated that they built the story on Charles Portis's 1968 classic western True Grit, a narrative centered on a hardened, reluctant hero journeying with a vengeful young companion, something a film critic should have known by heart. But this literary archetype is far older than Jordan's reference library, which is fitting, given that his own script for his failed TV pilot lacked in the narrative depth of a parking ticket. He dismisses the deconstructed hero as a tired trend because he confuses a foundational archetype with temporary fashion, because his brand of grift relies on volume rather than knowledge of film or film history. Screenwriter Nogueira A decorated playwright with a New York Times Critics pick and an overall deal at Warner Brothers, consulted trauma specialists to build a character with more psychological texture in a single scene than Jordan managed in an entire TV plot. Jordan's followers acknowledged that Kara's trauma is clinically real, yet stated that they would still prefer not to watch a character with that level of psychological dimension. They accepted the facts and chose a comfortable sneer instead, where accuracy is discarded because performative contempt is easier to swallow for them. Predictably, Jordan's engagement cattle stampeded right toward the Supergirl box office numbers. The film's domestic opening weekend pulled in a meager 37 million, a figure worse than both Morbius and the Marvels. And that specific statistic instantly became the central focus of their entire discourse. Consequently, a rigid narrative solidified. Anyone defending the film was dismissed as a paid shill. No arguments, because there was none. Jordan actively No argument, because there was none feeded to them by Jordan himself. Jordan actively primed this reaction by pointing out that even mainstream media outlets had turned against the project, thereby reinforcing the premise that positive reviews are inherently corrupt, while only negative reviews remain honest. Furthermore, even citing the figures for the Marvels, he inserted a brief aside of, quote, black girl magic, which, though framed as a joke, served as a calculated dog whistle regarding acceptable targets. Ultimately, whenever he is called out on these tactics, he just routinely ducks behind an entertainment defense to evade accountability. The trap Jordan sets ensures that the grift has no losing condition. If the film had succeeded, his narrative would shift to allegations of paid shills, critic conspiracies, and funded propaganda. Because it bombed at the box office, he falls back on standard culture war catchphrases. The actual outcome is irrelevant to the loop. It is a bet placed after the race with a ticket printed in both horses' names. However, a poor box office weekend does not retroactively alter the fundamental elements of the production. It does not turn Anna Nogueira into a failed actress, render Lobo into a post-production addition, or transform Rob Hardy's vintage anamorphic cinematography into chili sauce. A broken clock may tell the right time occasionally, but it remains fundamentally broken. Will Jordan frequently presents himself as a humble reporter without real power, despite commanding millions of subscribers and a Patreon following. He characterizes James Gunn's projects as vanity items and claims that James Gunn lacks a big picture vision and asserts that he makes Kathleen Kennedy look efficient. These statements are performative contempt rather than structural critiques. The film itself evaporates from his discussions while he focuses on release strategies and executive leadership. This entire comics is exposed by Jordan's own creative output. His proof of concept pilot was universally panned for poor writing, atrocious dialogue, and a bland story. His lecturing of established filmmakers on creative vision is equivalent to an individual who failed their driving test 7 times while attempting to explain how to run a Formula One team. Will Jordan claims to have predicted these outcomes of the Supergirl film bombing in the box office, and yet his preparation consisted of spending weeks spreading verifiable falsehoods regarding the screenwriter, the character's trauma, and the cinematography. His audience subsequently thanked him for saving the money by not going to see the movie. A clear instance of poisoning the well and then billing the water quality report. But here's the thing about Jordan. He doesn't actually hold his own opinions. He just follows the money. He who pays the piper holds the tune, and his subscribers are the ones footing the bill. When Jordan gave the Fallout television series a positive review, his audience revolted and forced him to backpedal. Comments flooded in calling him a sellout, and viewership dipped. He reversed his stance within weeks, suddenly discovering flaws that he hadn't noticed the first time around. A similar pattern occurred with the Fantastic Four. He initially praised it, and then his base rioted, and out came the follow-up video walking back everything he'd said. But this isn't a case of a helpless victim. It's the case of a tail wagging the dog, and he is happy to let it happen because the check's always clears. He knows exactly which side of his bread is buttered on. The mob dictates the script, and he reads it with a grin, cashing the checks all the way to the bank. Jordan's final assessment relies entirely on a pile of contradictions. The protagonist was said to be unlikable. The deconstructed hero was said to be tired. Management is incompetent, and the casting was a mistake. The film, well, he said, failed to appeal to men. And the marketing was flawed. And then he seals this with the assertion that it would have bombed even if it were good. This is a textbook example of kettle logic, named after a famous Freud anecdote. A man was accused of returning a broken kettle who says, "I never borrowed it. It was already broken when I took it, and I gave it back in a perfect condition." Each of those defenses on its own must be a complete explanation. But set together, they are mutually exclusive. If you never borrowed it, how could it have been broken when you took it? The contradiction is in the point. Jordan does the exact same thing. He claims that the protagonist was fundamentally unlikable, a complete explanation for failure on its own. Then he also claims that the film would have bombed no matter who the protagonist was, which makes the first excuse irrelevant. He claims the marketing failed to reach men, a complete explanation. And then he claims it would have failed with the perfect marketing, which cancels the first claim. Any one of these arguments, standing alone, could be debated. Stacked together, they are not a case. They're a pile of panic dressed as analysis. Kettle logic doesn't need consistency. It needs a volume, loud one. And his grift marks, overwhelmed by sheer quantity of grievances, accepts the conclusion without even noticing the underlying collapse of logic. William Thomas Jordan is a failed filmmaker, a context that makes his current grift legible. He previously wrote military thrillers and adapted one into a proof-of-concept pilot that exhibited the exact flaws he now rails against. His lead was personality-free protagonist. It was completely unlikable. The narrative was stale Cold War pastiche that felt dated, and critics described the project as hackneyed writing with atrocious dialogue. Really bad filmmaking. It represented the definition of a vanity project. The only phrase of his that does not apply is, quote, "Go woke, go broke," as the project was simply poor filmmaking that went broke when they ditched woke. When Will Jordan's pilot failed, he blamed the actors, the audience, and the industry. Precise behavior he now monetizes as critique. Obviously, that was not an objective analysis. It was the reaction of an individual who fell off the ladder and has dedicated his career to kicking the ladder down behind him, convincing millions that anyone at the top is a fraud. He labels Anna Nogueira a failed actress despite her credentials as a decorated playwright with an overall deal at Warner Brothers. He lectures James Gunn on vision despite his own inability to launch a single pilot. The critical grifter's performative contempt cycle was thus perfected to protect his own ego from the reality of his own creative limitations. Jordan's comment section is a carefully cultivated zoo of grift victims, and the exhibits are easy to catalog. First are the unpaid shills who wage his online battles for free while he collects the ad revenue, calling dissenting critics as shills with zero self-awareness. Next come the engagement cattle, endlessly repeating box office figures because their script contains nothing else. They mingle with the outrage junkies, the crowd that openly admits the character's trauma is clinically real, yet still demands another hit of negativity straight from the dealer's pipe. Ultimately, these people are just grift marks, thanking Jordan for saving them money while he quietly monetizes their attention. The rest of the space is filled by the echo chamber chorus, offering zero facts and infinite harmony of the same three notes, alongside the research allergic, who treat professional credentials as a personal enemy. Finally, the mediocrity mobs swarm the comment section without ever looking up the actual creators, acting as a disposable click logs in a larger monetization machine. Jordan broadcasts, the audience receives, and the loop spins on, enriching the platform and the man behind the avatar. An individual's taste remains subjective, and the film may simply not appeal to everyone. That's how every film do. However, a work deserves to be evaluated honestly rather than being processed through a 6-step formula designed to close the case before facts are even checked. Every Jordan video concludes with an instruction package as a sign-off. He would say, "Go away now." This functions to discourage further thought, fact-checking, or accountability. He doesn't even look up creators or consulting diagnostic criteria or examining his own filmography. It is a calculated sign-off designed to close the door before the audience notices the nature of the transaction. Removing the analytical label reveals the reality. He is a failed filmmaker selling tickets to a demolition. Breaking the loop requires doing the research, thinking for your own, and moving past the repetitive narrative. Subscribe.